The billionaire's laughter did not just stop, it died in his throat, choked off by a single line of green text on the monitor. 1 second, the lobby of Blackwell and Associates echoed with the amusement of New York's elite. The next, the room fell so quiet you could hear the hum of the server drives in the basement. Richard Blackwell, the man who treated Wall Street like his personal monopoly board, stared at the screen as the blood drained from his face. He looked at the dirty 12-year-old kid standing in front of him, then back at the number. His hands, usually steady enough to sign billion-dollar mergers without a tremor, began to shake. But to understand how a homeless kid froze the heart of the financial district, we have to rewind 3 hours, before the silence, before the shock, back to the heat. The morning sun hit the glass towers of Manhattan like a welding torch, baking the pavement until the air shimmered. Marcus stood outside the revolving doors of Blackwell Private Banking, watching his reflection in the gold-tinted glass. He did not look like he belonged in the frame. At 12 years old, Marcus had already learned the hardest lesson New York had to teach. There were people who owned the skyline and people who swept the floors. He was the latter. His sneakers were a size too big, the soles flapping with every step. Held together by strips of gray duct tape that were slowly losing their grip in the humidity. He had been pacing outside for 3 hours, working up the nerve to cross the threshold. He clutched a crumpled envelope in his pocket, so tight his knuckles ached. Inside was a piece of plastic that had shown up in his mailbox 6 months ago. No return address, no letter. Just a heavy black card with his name embossed in silver. Marcus took a breath, tasting the exhaust fumes of the city, and pushed through the heavy doors. The change was instant. The oppressive July heat vanished, replaced by a wall of aggressive air conditioning that chilled the sweat on his neck. The lobby was not just a room. It was a cathedral to capitalism. 30-foot marble columns held up a ceiling painted with frescoes that looked older than the country itself. Crystal chandeliers dripped light onto leather sofas that cost more than the Section 8 apartment Marcus shared with his mom, back when they still had the apartment. The air smelled different here. It did not smell like the subway or the stale heat of the shelter. It smelled like fresh lilies, furniture polish, and old money. Marcus felt the eyes on him immediately. He was a smudge of dirt on a pristine canvas. He had not showered in 3 days. The water in their building had been cut off again, and he knew the smear of grime on his cheek was visible. He kept his head down, the squeak of his taped sneakers echoing too loud against the marble floor as he walked toward the reception desk. "May I help you?" The voice was cool, professional, and entirely unwelcoming. The receptionist, a woman with her hair pulled back so tight it looked painful, peered over the rim of her glasses. She looked at Marcus the way a suburban homeowner looks at a raccoon tearing through a trash bag. "I." Marcus's voice cracked. He swallowed against the dryness in his throat and tried to channel the toughness he used on the playground. "I need to check my balance." The woman's perfectly sculpted eyebrows twitched. "I'm sorry, young man. This is a private wealth management firm. If you're looking for a restroom or a water fountain, there's a public park 3 blocks east." "I have an account here," Marcus said, the desperation leaking into his voice. He hated how weak he sounded. "I have a card." He pulled the envelope from his pocket. His hands trembled as he slid the black card onto the polished mahogany desk. It sat there, dark and heavy, like a hole in the universe. The receptionist sighed, loud enough for him to hear. She reached for the card with 2 fingers, as if it might be contagious. But as the light hit the surface, her expression shifted. The dismissal in her eyes flickered and turned into confusion. The logo was correct. The holographic chip was real. But the name, Marcus J. Holloway, belonged to the shivering kid in the dumpster dive clothes standing in front of her. "I." "See?" she said slowly, her brain clearly misfiring. She tapped a few keys on her terminal, frowning. "You'll need to speak with a portfolio manager. If you'll just take a seat." She gestured toward the leather chairs, but Marcus was not listening. The atmosphere in the room had shifted. The heavy oak doors behind the reception desk swung open, and the temperature seemed to drop another 10 degrees. Richard Blackwell strode into the lobby like he had personally invented banking. He was the kind of man who took up space just by existing. At 45, Blackwell was the face of American finance, on the cover of Forbes, a regular on CNBC, the guy who managed money for tech moguls and senators. He wore a Navy bespoke suit that fit like armor. On his wrist sat a Patek Philippe watch worth enough to feed Marcus's entire neighborhood for a decade. He was laughing at something an associate said, a deep, resonant sound that reeked of confidence. Then he saw Marcus. The smile stayed on his face, but the warmth drained from his eyes. He looked at the boy with a mix of amusement and profound disgust. "Janet," Blackwell called out. His voice was not loud, but it cut through the lobby's hush like a knife. "Is there a reason we're running a daycare center for the homeless today? I thought we paid the security firm a premium to keep the lobby sterile." The words hit Marcus like a slap. Around them, the other clients, men in three-piece suits and women dripping in pearls, let their hushed conversations die out and turn to watch. "Sir," Janet stammered, flustered under her boss's attention. "The young man claims he has an account." He presented a card. "An account?" Blackwell's laugh was sharp, a bark of cruelty that invited everyone else in on the joke. He walked closer, towering over the boy. "Look at him, Janet. He's wearing his wardrobe. The only account this kid is familiar with is the one his parents have at the liquor store down the street." A ripple of laughter moved through the room. A woman near the window covered her mouth, her eyes crinkling with mean delight. A man shook his head, muttering that the city was going to the dogs. Marcus felt heat rise in his cheeks, a burning shame that made his eyes sting. Every instinct he had screamed at him to run, to turn around, push through the doors, and disappear back into the anonymity of the streets where he belonged. "I'm waiting for security," Blackwell said, checking his watch with an exaggerated sigh. "Get this trash out of my sight before he steals the pens." "Wait." Marcus's voice was small, but he planted his feet. He looked up at the towering banker. "Check the card. Just check it." Blackwell stopped. He looked down at the boy, a predator toying with a mouse that refused to die. He smirked, snatched the black card from the desk, and held it up to the light, mocking its very existence. "You want me to check it?" Blackwell asked, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "All right, kid, let's entertain this fantasy. Let's see exactly how many cents you have to your name." He swiped the card through the terminal facing the lobby, making sure the big screen that faced the clients would show the result to the entire room. He wanted a show. He wanted to make an example. "Let's see the zeros," Blackwell sneered. He turned his eyes to the screen, ready to laugh again. The system processed, the hourglass spun, and then the numbers appeared. Blackwell's mouth opened to deliver the punchline. But no sound came out. The room went dead silent, because the number on the screen was not zero, and it was not just a bank balance. It was an impossibility that made the blood run cold in Richard Blackwell's veins. We left Richard Blackwell staring at a computer screen, his face drained of color. The lobby of his private bank plunged into a dead silence. But to understand the sheer magnitude of the fear in his eyes, you have to understand the 5 minutes that led up to it. The moment Marcus almost turned around and ran, because seconds before that screen lit up, Marcus J. Holloway was ready to bolt, standing on that marble floor, surrounded by people whose shoes cost more than his mother's yearly rent. The shame was suffocating. He felt the duct tape on his sneakers peeling. He felt the grime on his skin. The impulse to flee was a physical ache in his chest. But then, an image flashed in his mind. He saw the eviction notice taped to their apartment door, bright orange, legally binding, giving them 48 hours before the sheriff came to change the locks. He saw his little sister, Emma, sitting on the floor that morning, looking up at him with wide, trusting eyes. "Marcus?" she had asked, her voice small. "Are we going to have dinner tonight? My stomach hurts." He had lied to her. He had told her yes. And that lie was the only thing keeping his feet planted on the floor now. "I have a card," Marcus said again. His voice was shaking, but he forced it louder, cutting through the murmurs of the lobby. "And I want to check my balance." Richard Blackwell, leaning back in his executive chair, let out a sigh that was equal parts irritation and boredom. He hovered a hand over the phone, ready to summon the armed guards waiting in the wings. "Security," Blackwell barked. And 2 uniformed men started toward the desk, their hands resting on their belts. Marcus flinched. This was it. Jail. Foster care. The end. But then, Blackwell raised a hand. He stopped the guards with a sharp flick of his wrist. A new expression crossed the banker's face. Not kindness. Definitely not empathy. It was the look a cat gives a mouse when it realizes the mouse is cornered. It was the look of a predator, deciding to play with its food. Actually, wait, Blackwell said. A slow, oily smile spread across his face. He steepled his manicured fingers. This could be entertaining. He gestured for Marcus to step closer. Come here, boy. Let's see this imaginary fortune. Marcus walked forward. His legs felt like jelly. The squeak of his sneakers echoed like gunshots in the quiet room. He could feel the judgment pressing against his back. The wealthy clients watching the spectacle, waiting for the street kid to get crushed. When he reached the massive mahogany desk, Marcus had to crane his neck to look Richard in the eye. Let me guess, Blackwell said, his voice carrying to the back of the room, making sure everyone caught the joke. You fished this card out of a dumpster? Or maybe you swiped it from a mailbox in a zip code you do not belong in. Blackwell leaned in. His cologne smelled of expensive citrus and cruelty. That is mail fraud, kid. That is a federal crime. I could have the FBI here before you blink. I did not steal it, Marcus whispered. He reached into his pocket, his fingers brushing the worn photograph of his mom he kept for luck. Be brave, baby, she used to tell him. Stand tall. It came to me. It has my name on it. Your name, Blackwell repeated, chuckling. And what name is that? Should I be looking for a Rockefeller hiding under the grime? Marcus, the boy said, his voice starting to steady. Marcus J. Holloway. Blackwell rolled his eyes, a performance for his audience. Marcus Holloway. Right. He turned to the computer and began to type. His fingers flew across the keyboard with exaggerated flair, like he was humoring a toddler's fantasy. Let's see what the system says about Mr. Holloway, Blackwell sneered. I am sure the results will be fascinating. The typing stopped. Blackwell hit the enter key with a little flourish. The lobby held its breath. The wealthy clients were smirking, waiting for the red invalid notification, waiting for the security guards to drag the trash out. Blackwell's eyes stayed locked on the screen, his mouth already shaping the next insult. Ladies and gentlemen, he began, his voice dripping with sarcasm. It appears we have a genuine. The word caught in his throat. Blackwell stopped. He blinked once, twice. He leaned forward, squinting at the monitor as if the pixels were playing a trick on him. The smirk slid off his face like slush off a windshield. The silence that followed was not the silence of anticipation anymore. It was heavy, suffocating, the kind of silence after a bomb has landed but has not detonated yet. Blackwell's face went through a rapid shift, from arrogance to confusion, then to disbelief, and finally to a stark, primal fear. That is impossible, Blackwell whispered. The microphone on his desk caught it, amplifying the tremor in his voice for the whole room to hear. He looked at Marcus, really looked at him this time. He did not see a dirty kid anymore. He saw something that made his hands go cold. Janet, Blackwell croaked, his voice cracking. Refresh the system. There is a glitch. There has to be a glitch. But deep down, Richard Blackwell, a man who had spent 23 years climbing the ladder of American finance, knew exactly what he was looking at. And he knew that the number on that screen did not just mean money. It meant that the boy standing in front of him was not just a customer. He was the owner of a secret that was about to burn Blackwell's entire world to the ground. We left Richard Blackwell staring at his monitor, the blood drained from his face, whispering that it was impossible. But the number on the screen did not blink. It did not glitch. It just sat there, glowing in high-definition green, mocking everything Richard thought he understood about the world. Richard had spent 2 decades in high finance. He had seen tech CEOs make $10 million before breakfast and lose it by lunch. He had seen old money that dated back to the railways, but he had never seen an 8-figure balance attached to a kid whose sneakers were held together by prayer and duct tape. There is a technical error, Richard muttered, his voice tight. He jabbed the escape key over and over, trying to force the system to refresh. The server is pulling the wrong data. It has to be, because the alternative was insane. The alternative was that this boy, who smelled like he had not seen a bar of soap in a week, was richer than half the people currently sitting in the lobby. Richard looked up at Marcus. He really looked at him this time. The dirt on the boy's cheek was not just a smudge from a playground. It was the deep-set grime of poverty. His clothes were not just thrift store finds. They were splitting at the seams. The duct tape on his shoes was not a fashion statement. It was a survival tactic. This was a kid who knew what hunger felt like. And yet, the screen said he was worth $47 million. Janet? Richard snapped, not looking away from the boy. Get over here, now. The receptionist hurried over, her heels clicking fast on the marble. She looked from the terrified boy to her boss's pale face. Verify this, Richard ordered, pointing a shaking finger at the screen. Pull up the Holloway account on your terminal. I want a cross-check. Now. Janet's fingers flew across her keyboard. Richard watched her face, waiting for relief, waiting for her to say, "Oh, it is a decimal error, sir. It is actually $47. Instead, Janet's eyes went wide. She stopped typing. She swallowed hard, her throat clicking in the silence. "Sir," she whispered, leaning in so the clients behind them would not hear. "It matches. The balance is correct." "Say it," Richard hissed. 47.3 million, Janet said, her voice trembling. "The last deposit was 6 months ago. A cashier's check. No withdrawals. No activity." Richard's mind raced, spinning through the mental Rolodex of white-collar crimes he knew by heart. Money laundering, cartel assets, a tax evasion scheme where criminals used a dead-end kid as a mule to hide assets from the IRS. It had to be. There was no other logical explanation in the universe. He turned back to Marcus, his shock hardening into suspicion. The predator was back. "Marcus," Richard said, his voice dropping an octave, turning dangerous. "I need you to be very honest with me, or things are going to get very bad, very fast." Where did you get this card?" "It came in the mail," Marcus said, shrinking back slightly. 6 months ago. There was a letter. A letter from who?" Richard pressed, leaning over the desk. "Who sent you this, money boy?" "My mom," Marcus said. His voice cracked on the word, shattering the tension in the room. "She sent it before she died." The lobby, which had been buzzing with low whispers, went dead silent. The air felt sucked out of the room. Richard felt a twinge of something in his chest. Shame, maybe. But he crushed it instantly. "I see," he said, his tone skeptical. "And what did your mother do, Marcus? Was she an investment banker, an heiress?" "She was a cleaner," Marcus said. He lifted his chin, his eyes flashing with a sudden, fierce pride. "She cleaned offices at night. She worked at a laundromat during the day. She worked 3 jobs so we could eat." Richard let out a short, incredulous laugh. "A cleaning lady with $47 million. He shook his head, looking around the room as if to say, "Do you believe this liar?" "Let's cut the act, son," Richard said, his voice sharpening. "Cleaning ladies do not have 8-figure estates. Unless, was your mother involved in something illegal? Did she move things for people? Hide things?" "My mom was not a criminal," Marcus shouted. The sound ripped through the polished air of the bank. "She was the best person I ever knew. She worked herself to death." The energy in the room shifted, hard. The wealthy clients were not laughing anymore. The woman in the pearls looked down at her lap, suddenly fascinated by her diamond ring. The man in the 3-piece suit cleared his throat and turned away. Richard had gone too far, and everyone knew it. "Look," Richard said, realizing he was losing the audience. "We need to move this. Janet, call security. Take Mr. Holloway to conference room B. We need to call the authorities to sort this." "Actually," a deep voice cut through the air, like a gavel strike. "I'll take it from here." Richard froze. He looked up and saw James Morrison striding across the lobby floor. James was the old guard, 63 years old, with eyes that had watched every market crash since 1987, and a reputation that made Richard look like an amateur. He was the senior executive of the firm, a man who rarely left his corner office on the top floor. "James," Richard stammered, scrambling to regain his footing. "I'm handling this. It's clearly a fraud case. I was just about to." "No, Richard," James said calmly. He came to a stop between the billionaire banker and the homeless kid. "You're making a scene." James turned to Richard. His voice dropped to a whisper, colder than liquid nitrogen. "And you are about to make the biggest mistake of your career." He turned his back on Richard and looked down at Marcus. For the first time since Marcus had walked through the revolving doors, someone looked at him with something other than disgust. "Hello, Marcus," James said softly. "My name is James. I've been waiting for you." Marcus blinked, confused. "You? You have?" "I have," James nodded, "and I think it is time you found out exactly who your mother really was." We left Richard Blackwell humiliated in his own lobby, watching his control evaporate as James Morrison, the bank's senior executive, stepped in to save the day. But as the elevator doors slid shut, sealing Marcus and James inside, the real story was just beginning. Because the money in that account was not just a fortune. It was a breadcrumb trail to a tragedy. Richard stood frozen near the reception desk. He tried to take a step toward the elevators, the old instinct to control the narrative kicking in. "James," Richard called out, his voice pitching a little too high. "I really think I should be present for this. Protocol dictates." "You have done enough, Richard," James said. He did not even turn around. He just held the elevator door open with one hand, ushering Marcus inside. "Stay here. Attend to your actual clients. I will handle the Holloway account." The doors closed with a soft chime, cutting off Richard's protest. The silence that followed in the lobby was heavy. Every client, every secretary, every security guard had just watched the Lion of Wall Street get declawed by a 63-year-old man in a cardigan. Richard sank back into his chair, feeling the weight of 100 eyes on him. For the first time since he was a bullied kid in prep school, Richard Blackwell felt the cold, sticky sweat of shame. 30 floors up, the atmosphere was different. James led Marcus into the executive suite. It was a world away from the cold marble of the lobby. Here, the carpet was thick enough to swallow the sound of footsteps. The lighting was warm amber. The view of the Manhattan skyline was breathtaking. But Marcus did not look out the window. He was looking at the pitcher of ice water on the mahogany conference table, like it was the Holy Grail. "First things first," James said. He poured a glass and slid it across the table. Marcus drank it in one long, desperate gulp. James watched him, noting the hollows in the boy's cheeks. "Are you hungry?" James asked. "I can have the kitchen send something up." As if on cue, Marcus's stomach growled, loud enough to vibrate the table. Marcus flinched, wrapping his arms around his midsection, his face burning. "I will take that as a yes," James said gently. He pressed the intercom button. "Martha, send up the club sandwich platter, the fruit tray, and bring the double chocolate cookies. Enough for 3 people." There were only 2 of them in the room. James hung up and settled into the leather chair opposite Marcus. He did not open the file yet. He just let the boy breathe. "Why?" Marcus asked, his voice rough. "Why are you being nice to me? Everyone else downstairs looked at me like I was trash." James sighed. He took off his wire-rimmed glasses and cleaned them on his tie. "Because, Marcus, unlike Richard Blackwell, I have not forgotten where I came from." He leaned forward, his eyes locking onto the boy's. "I grew up in the South Bronx in the 1960s. My dad drove a city bus. My mother cleaned houses on the Upper East Side, houses just like the one Richard probably lives in. I was the first person in my family to go to college, and I scrubbed dishes every night for 4 years to pay for it." Marcus studied the old man's face. He was searching for the trick, the hidden camera, the sneer, but he found only tired sincerity. "Okay," Marcus whispered. "Now," James said, powering up his tablet. "Let's talk about this account." He swiped through the data, his brow furrowing deeper with every line he read. "This file is remarkable," James murmured. "The account was opened 6 months ago. By your mother, correct?" "I think so," Marcus said. "She never told me. I just got the card and the letter in the mail yesterday. After she..." He could not finish the sentence. The word "died" felt too heavy to say in this fancy room. "May I see the letter?" James asked softly. Marcus reached into his pocket and pulled out the folded piece of notebook paper. It was soft from being handled, the creases deep and fraying. He handed it over with trembling fingers. James unfolded it, like it was an ancient manuscript. He read in silence. As his eyes moved across the handwritten lines, the professional detachment slipped from his face. His jaw tightened. He blinked rapidly, fighting back moisture. When he finished, he placed the letter gently on the table and cleared his throat. "Marcus," he said, his voice thick. "Your mother she was an extraordinary woman." "Can you tell me what the money is?" Marcus pleaded. "I do not understand. We never had money. We got evicted today. Mom worked 3 jobs and we still ate ramen every night. How could she leave millions? James looked at the tablet, then back at the boy. Mao, this was the part he dreaded explaining. 6 months ago, your mother came to this bank, James began. She did not use the front door. She came in through the service entrance because she was working a shift with the cleaning crew. But she managed to corner a junior associate, someone young, someone who would listen. Listen to what? Marcus asked, leaning in. She told them she had been saving, James said. But not in a bank. She told them that for 10 years, she had been paying into a policy. Every extra dollar she made, tips, overtime, money she probably needed for food, she sent it to an insurance company. James paused, letting the reality sink in. The money in this account is not savings, Marcus. It is a payout. It is a life insurance policy. Insurance? Marcus whispered. Like, for when you die? Yes, a policy valued at $50 million. The number hung in the air, too big to hold in his mind. 50 million. It was a number for astronauts and movie stars, not for Marcus's mom, who used to glue the soles of her work boots back together. But how? Marcus asked. That costs a lot of money, does it not? She paid about $30 a month, James explained, his voice full of quiet awe. For 10 years, God knows what she had to give up to make those payments. A skipped meal here, walking to work instead of taking the bus there. She built this fortune on her own suffering, Marcus, dollar by dollar. James tapped the screen, and she was brilliant about it. She set up a trust with ironclad conditions. The principal amount, the big money, is locked until you turn 25. No one can touch it. Not you, not the government, and certainly not the bank. But until then, James continued, you have a monthly allowance. And Marcus, the allowance alone is enough to buy your apartment building. Twice. Marcus stared at the table, his vision blurring. Mayo, he thought of his mom. He thought of her wearing the same faded coat for 5 winters. He thought of the nights she said she was not hungry, so he and Emma could have seconds. She had not been broke. She had been building an empire. Why? Marcus choked out. A tear finally slipped free, carving a line through the dirt on his cheek. Why did she not tell me? We could have used a little bit of it, just enough to stop the lights from getting cut off. Why did she keep it a secret? James picked up the letter again. He studied the handwriting, especially the last paragraph, the one he had not read aloud yet. Because, Marcus, James said, his voice dropping to a grave whisper. According to this letter, she was not just saving the money for your future. James looked up. His eyes were dark, with a new, unsettling realization. She was hiding it, because she knew that if the wrong people found out where this policy actually came from, they would not just take the money, they would come for you. We left Marcus staring at James, trying to understand why his mother, a woman who scrubbed floors until her knuckles bled, would hide a $50 million secret. She did not just want to protect the money, Marcus, James said, his voice lowering to a reverence usually reserved for church. She wanted to protect you. James leaned in, the Manhattan skyline reflecting in his wire-rimmed glasses. She knew she was dying, and she knew that if she told you about the money, you would have spent every dime trying to save her. You would have hired the best doctors, tried experimental treatments, burned through this entire trust just to buy her another month of pain. He tapped the worn letter on the table. She did not want you to watch her die twice. She wanted you to remember her standing tall. She wanted to be your mother, not your patient. A sharp knock at the door shattered the heavy silence. A young assistant walked in, carrying a silver tray that smelled like heaven. Roasted turkey, crisp bacon, fresh bread. She set it down, offered a polite, professional smile to the dirty kid in the executive chair, and slipped back out. Eat, James said softly. Marcus did not wait. He grabbed a club sandwich quarter with both hands. The first bite hit his tongue like an explosion of flavor, and his eyes filled with tears. He ate with a frantic animal intensity, the kind that comes from not knowing when the next meal is coming. Between bites, James kept talking, filling the silence with calm assurances. He explained the legal language of the trust. He explained that Emma was covered, school, medical, everything. Marcus was halfway through a third sandwich when the phone on the table buzzed. A single, aggressive vibration. James glanced at the screen. His expression hardened instantly. The warmth drained from his eyes, replaced by the cold calculation of a man who had survived Wall Street for 40 years. "It seems Richard is busy," James said, his tone turning icy. "What is he doing?" Marcus asked. He swallowed a mouthful of bread that suddenly felt like dry ash. "He is making calls," James said, swiping the notification away. "He has contacted the legal department. He is threatening to call the FBI Financial Crimes Division. He is pushing a story that this is money laundering, narcotics, fraud." Panic flared in Marcus's chest. He dropped the sandwich. "But it is not," he blurted. "My mom was not a criminal." "I know," James said. His voice cut through the panic like a laser. "And I have the paperwork to prove it. The insurance payout is from a Tier 1 provider. The trust is ironclad. Everything is clean." "Then why is he doing this?" Marcus asked, his voice trembling. "Does he hate me?" James shook his head. "He does not hate you, son. He hates being wrong." James stood up and walked to the window, looking down at the street 14 floors below. "Richard Blackwell has built a brand on being the smartest predator in the jungle," James said. "He reads people for a living. And today, he looked at a multi-millionaire and saw a beggar. You did not just bruise his ego, Marcus. You shattered it. And a man like Richard will burn the whole building down before he admits he made a mistake." Down in the lobby, Richard Blackwell was trying to figure out how to stop the bleeding. He sat at his massive desk, but the power dynamic had shifted. He could feel the eyes of his staff boring into him. He could hear the phantom whispers of the clients. "That is the guy who tried to kick out the whale. That is the guy who missed the call." For the first time in 20 years, Richard felt a sensation he thought he had surgically removed from his mind. Uncertainty. His phone buzzed. A text from James. "Conference room B. Now. And bring the file. Leave the attitude." Richard's jaw clenched so hard a muscle popped in his cheek. He hated James Morrison. He hated the old man's soft approach, his client-first philosophy, his refusal to squeeze every last margin. But right now, he hated him for one simple reason. James was holding the cards. The elevator ride to the 14th floor felt like a funeral procession. Richard checked his reflection in the polished steel doors. He straightened his tie. He smoothed his silver hair. He tried to rebuild the armor of the invincible banker. But the cracks were there, visible. The doors opened. Richard walked down the hallway, took a deep breath, and pushed open the heavy oak door to conference room B. He expected a confrontation. He expected shouting. What he found was a domestic scene that threw him off balance. Marcus was still eating, wiping mayonnaise from his lip with a linen napkin. In the warm light of the executive suite, without the harsh glare of the lobby, the boy looked different. Richard finally saw the details he had been too arrogant to notice downstairs. He saw the boy's eyes, large, dark, and intelligent. He saw the hands, small, but roughened with calluses no 12-year-old should have. They were not the hands of a thief. They were the hands of a protector. James sat across from the boy, surrounded by stacks of paper. He did not look up when Richard entered. He simply pointed to an empty chair. "Richard," James said, his voice dangerously neutral. "Thank you for joining us. Sit down." Richard hesitated. The air in the room was thick with tension. He pulled out the chair and sat, the leather creaking loud in the quiet. He looked at the documents spread out on the table. He recognized the letterhead on the insurance policy. He recognized the seal on the trust fund. It was all legitimate. There was no fraud. There was no crime. But then, James slid a single thin file folder across the mahogany table toward him. It was not about the money. Richard opened it. His eyes skimmed the first paragraph, and the blood that had just returned to his face drained away again. "I pulled the phone logs, Richard," James said softly, his tone leaving no room for argument. "I know you did not just call legal act. You called the district attorney's personal line. You tried to trigger a federal investigation into a grieving child to save your own face." James leaned forward, his eyes turning dark. "And if you do not want that phone call to be the last thing you ever do in this industry, you are going to listen to exactly what I say next." We left Richard Blackwell sitting in conference room B, staring at a manila folder that James Morrison had just slid across the mahogany table. Inside that folder lay the answer to the $47 million question. Richard opened it, expecting to find the smoking gun, A wire transfer from the Caymans, a shell company in Panama, something that would prove his cynicism right. Instead, he found receipts. Hundreds of them, Western Union slips, money orders, crumpled deposit stubs, dated back 10 years. "I have audited the entire history," James said. His voice held no triumph, only a quiet, simmering anger. "It is clean, Richard. Every single cent comes from a tiered life insurance policy. Linda Chen did not steal a dime. She bought a policy a decade ago and fed it every month like it was a starving animal." Richard flipped through the pages. The math was undeniable. The premiums were paid with clockwork precision. "Linda Chen was a cleaner," James went on, watching the color drain from Richard's face. "She cleaned office buildings in the financial district. In fact, she had a contract with this building. She probably emptied the trash can under your desk while you were busy closing deals." Richard felt a cold knot form in his stomach. He looked down at his own hands. He thought about the late nights he had spent in his office, ignoring the hum of the vacuum in the hallway, never once looking up to see the face of the woman wiping down the glass doors. "She worked 3 jobs," James said, driving the point home. 70 hours a week. Every spare dollar went into this policy. Look at page 4. Richard turned the page. "That gap in employment?" James pointed to a date 4 years earlier. "She was in the ICU at Mount Si NYE with double pneumonia. She almost died. But look at the payment history." Richard looked. The payment had been made. On time. "She paid her premium from a hospital bed," James whispered. "She was drowning in fluid, hooked up to a ventilator, and her only thought was making sure that if she stopped breathing, her kids would not stop eating." Across the table, Marcus had stopped eating his sandwich. He stared down at his lap, his small shoulders shaking silently. "The policy was structured to compound," James explained, shifting into the cold language of their trade, which only made the truth hit harder. "It was a high-yield trust vehicle. She locked the principal until Marcus turns 25 to prevent predation. She prepaid Emma's college tuition. She built in inflation adjustments." Richard looked up, genuinely baffled. "How? This is sophisticated estate planning. This is the kind of work we charge 50 grand to set up. How does a cleaning lady know how to structure a dynasty trust?" "She read," Marcus said. It was the first time the boy had spoken in 10 minutes. His voice was thick with tears, but steady. "She went to the public library every night after her second shift," Marcus said, wiping his nose with the back of his hand. "She told me she was taking English classes, but she was not. She was studying. She was learning how to save us." Richard looked at the boy, really looked at him, and felt the armor of his ego finally crack. He was not the smartest man in the room. He never had been. He had just been the richest, and the woman he had dismissed as trash had outsmarted the entire banking system out of sheer, desperate love. "There is a letter," James said softly. He picked up the worn, folded notebook paper Marcus had guarded like treasure. "She left instructions." "Read it," Richard whispered. He needed to hear it. He needed the punishment. James cleared his throat. He unfolded the paper, smoothing the creases with a tenderness that made Richard look away. "My dearest Marcus," James read. "If you are reading this, it means I am gone, and I am sorry. I am sorry for the birthdays I will miss and the graduation I will not see." The room was silent, except for the low hum of the air conditioning. "People will look at my life," James continued, "at the scrubbing, the uniforms, the late nights, and they will think I failed. They will think I was weak. But you must know the truth. I was exactly who I needed to be. I was a mother. And this money is not an apology for being poor. It is a promise. It is a shield." James paused. His eyes slid to Richard, then back to the page. "But listen to me closely, my son," he read. "Money does not make you better. It does not make you smart, or kind, or worthy. The world is going to treat you differently now. Doors will open. Men in suits will smile at you. But remember this. The people who treat you well because you are rich are the exact same people who would have spit on you when you were poor." The words hit Richard like a physical blow, a condemnation from the grave, precise and devastating. "Be kind to the workers," the letter concluded, "to the cleaners, the cashiers, the invisible people, because every one of them is someone's mother. Build a good life, Marcus. Be happy." James folded the letter. He placed it gently back in front of Marcus. Richard sat in silence, shame burning hot in his chest. He opened his mouth to apologize, to offer some hollow phrase, but the words died in his throat. "She was right," Richard finally croaked. "About everything." "She was," James agreed. He closed the manila folder. But James did not put the folder away. Instead, he reached into his briefcase and pulled out a second document, one that was not in the pile Richard had reviewed. A single sheet of legal paper, stamped with a red seal. "She was right about one other thing, too," James said. His voice was suddenly hard, stripped of all sentiment. Richard looked up, confused. "What is that?" "Linda Chen was thorough, Richard," James said. "She did not just plan for her children's education. She planned for threats." James slid the document across the table. It was a notarized affidavit dated 3 weeks before Linda's death. "She knew the bank might fight the payout," James said, his eyes locking onto Richard's. "And she knew exactly who ran this branch. She remembered you, Richard, from the nights she cleaned your office." Richard looked down at the paper. It was not a financial document. It was a witness statement. "She saw things," James said, his voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. "Late nights, shredded documents, conversations she was not supposed to hear. She wrote it all down, Richard. And she added a clause to the trust." James leaned forward, delivering the final blow. "If the bank attempts to block the funds, or if anyone attempts to intimidate her son, this affidavit goes directly to the SEC." Richard stared at the document, his blood running cold. He had not just insulted a wealthy client. He had handed the authorities the key to his own destruction. We left Richard Blackwell staring at a notarized affidavit that threatened to end his career. But before the fear could fully take root, James Morrison unfolded the last piece of paper in the pile. It was not a legal threat. It was the end of Linda Chen's letter. James read the final lines, his voice steady but quiet. "That is all I ever wanted for you, Marcus. To be happy. I love you more than all the stars in the sky. Forever, your mother." James refolded the note and handed it back. Marcus took it with both hands, pressing it against his chest, like it was a shield. The silence in the conference room was absolute. Richard looked at the boy, really looked at him, and the predator in his mind finally went quiet. He felt a sensation he had not felt since he was an intern fetching coffee. Humility. "I am sorry," Richard said. The words tasted like ash in his mouth. He cleared his throat and tried again. "Marcus, I am genuinely sorry for how I treated you downstairs." Marcus looked up. His eyes were dry now, hardened by a life Richard could not begin to imagine. "Are you sorry because you were wrong about the money?" Marcus asked. His voice cut through the air like a razor. "Or are you sorry because you were mean to a kid who did not deserve it?" Richard froze. He wanted to lie. He wanted to give the public relations answer. But when he looked at the duct tape on the boy's shoes, the lie died in his throat. "Both," Richard admitted, letting out a breath he did not know he was holding. "I am sorry for both, and I know that does not fix it, but it is the truth." Marcus studied him for a long, agonizing second. Then he gave a small, almost imperceptible nod. It was not forgiveness. Richard had not earned that yet, but it was a truce. "So," Marcus asked, looking between the two men, "what happens now?" "Now," James said, shifting back into business mode, "we stabilize your life. You are a minor. We need to contact Child Protective Services to appoint a temporary guardian until you turn 18. "I do not have anyone," Marcus said quickly. "Just Emma. Mom was an only child. Dad took off before I was born." "Then we will find someone," James assured him. "The trust has provisions for professional guardianship. We will find someone your mother would have approved of. But first, we need to get you out of your current housing." "We cannot just leave," Marcus said, panic flaring in his eyes. "Our stuff is there. Emma is there." "We will get Emma," Richard cut in. Both James and Marcus turned to look at him. Richard surprised even himself with the words. He was already calculating the spin. Top banker rescues orphaned millionaires. But underneath the calculation, there was a real urge to fix the mess he had made. "The bank owns several corporate units in the Battery Park complex," Richard said, leaning forward. "Full security, concierge. It is 2 blocks away. I can have a 3-bedroom unit ready in 48 hours. "That is generous," James said, eyeing Richard with open suspicion. "I cannot," Marcus whispered, staring down at his hands. "That is too much. I just came here to check my balance for groceries. Marcus, Richard said, dropping the corporate tone completely. Your life changed the second you walked through those doors. Your mother did not save $50 million so you could sleep in a drafty apartment. She did it so you would never have to worry about rent again. I do not know how to be rich. Marcus admitted, his voice small. I do not know how to live in a place like that. You will learn, James said softly. But tonight, you need to be safe. An hour later, Richard's obsidian black Mercedes S-Class rolled through the South Bronx like a spaceship that had crash-landed on the wrong planet. James had offered to send a private security detail to collect the sister, but Richard had insisted on driving. He told himself it was to ensure the client's satisfaction. The truth was, he needed to see it. He needed to see where a woman could save a fortune while living in hell. He parked in front of a 5-story walk-up that looked like it had been condemned during the Carter administration. The brick facade was crumbling. Fire escapes hung off the side of the building like rusted skeletons. Piles of black trash bags baked on the sidewalk, torn open by rats, spilling rot onto the concrete. This is it? Richard asked, his hand tightening on the steering wheel. 4th floor, Marcus said, unbuckling his seatbelt. Elevator has been broken since I was 10. We have to walk. Richard stepped out of the car. He locked it. Then he locked it again. He felt the weight of his Patek Philippe watch on his wrist, a beacon that screamed, "Rob me." On the stoop, a group of teenagers in hoodies stopped talking as the suit walked up. Their eyes tracked Richard with a mix of hostility and calculation. Hey, Carlos, Miguel, Marcus said, stepping between Richard and the group. One of the boys, a lanky kid with a scar over his eyebrow, stood up. Marcus? Man, where you been? Mrs. Rodriguez has been freaking out. Emma has been crying for 3 hours. I had business, Marcus said, his voice dropping an octave, trying to sound tougher than he was. I am here now. Carlos looked at Richard, taking in the bespoke suit and the Italian leather shoes. Who is the Fed? He asked. He is helping me, Marcus said firmly. It is cool, Carlos, I promise. Marcus pulled open the heavy steel front door, and Richard followed him into the lobby. If the outside was bad, the inside was a nightmare. The smell hit Richard first, a thick, choking mix of stale urine, boiled cabbage, and black mold. The hallway lights were smashed, leaving the stairwell in half darkness. The walls were peeling, revealing layers of lead paint like diseased skin. Richard pulled a handkerchief from his pocket and pressed it to his nose, gagging slightly. Watch your step, Marcus said, stepping over a puddle of questionable liquid near the stairs. The second step on the 3rd flight is missing. They began to climb. 1 flight, 2 flights. By the time they reached the 3rd landing, Richard was sweating, and not just from the stairs. He could hear shouting behind one of the doors, a domestic fight that sounded like it was about to turn violent. Somewhere above them, a dog barked in a steady, vicious rhythm. Almost there, Marcus said, turning the corner to the 4th floor. But as they reached the landing, Marcus stopped dead in his tracks. What is it? Richard asked, coming up behind him, breathless. Marcus did not answer. He was staring at the door to apartment 4B, his apartment. The door was not locked. It was not even closed. The wood around the lock was splintered, jagged shards sticking out where a crowbar had been jammed into the frame. The door stood slightly open, showing nothing but darkness inside. Emma, Marcus whispered, the blood draining from his face. He did not wait for Richard. He bolted toward the broken door, screaming his sister's name into the dark. Marcus hurled himself through the splintered doorway, his voice cracking as he shouted, Emma! He expected violence. He expected blood. But what he found was a different kind of tragedy. In the center of the 400-square-foot room, huddled on a sagging sofa patched with duct tape, sat an 8-year-old girl and an elderly woman, Mrs. Rodriguez. The neighbor from 4A held Emma tight, gripping a cast-iron skillet like a weapon of war. Marcus! Mrs. Rodriguez lowered the pan, her face crumpling with relief. Gracias a Dios. We heard the car doors. We thought he was back. Marcus crossed the room in 2 strides. He dropped to his knees and wrapped his arms around his sister. Emma buried her face in his neck, her small body trembling. Richard stepped carefully over the jagged wood of the doorframe. He stood in the entryway, feeling absurdly large and expensive in his bespoke suit. The air inside smelled of bleach, boiled cabbage, and fear. "Who did this?" Richard asked, his voice low. He nodded toward the destroyed lock. Mrs. Rodriguez's eyes narrowed as she looked at the billionaire banker. "The super," she spat. "He came an hour ago, said if the back rent was not paid by morning, he would not bother with the sheriff. He would just take the door off the hinges and let the street handle the rest." Richard felt a cold, sick weight settle in his stomach. He managed billions in assets, but he had no frame of reference for a world where a landlord could weaponize a front door. He looked around the apartment. It was tiny, one room serving as kitchen, living, and dining area, with 2 closet-sized bedrooms branching off. The linoleum was peeling, revealing rot underneath. But in the middle of the decay, there was a stubborn, heartbreaking dignity. The counters were scrubbed spotless. A vase of plastic daisies sat on the wobbly table, catching a sliver of sunlight from the air shaft. The walls were covered in children's drawings, taped up with care, bright splashes of color in a gray world. "Who is this?" Mrs. Rodriguez asked, pulling Emma closer. Her eyes locked on Richard's Patek Philippe watch. "He looks like the IRS." "He is. Helping," Marcus said, pulling back to look at his sister. He wiped a streak of tear-stained dirt from her cheek. "Emma, look at me. Are you okay?" "I was scared," Emma whispered, her voice hitching. "Mrs. Rodriguez said you went to do grown-up business. I thought they took you away like they took Mom." "No," Marcus vowed, his voice suddenly fierce. "I am never leaving you. Never." He took a breath, his hands shaking as he held her small shoulders. "Emma, I have to tell you something about Mom." The room went quiet. Mrs. Rodriguez crossed herself. "This man," Marcus said, gesturing to Richard, "he is from the bank. Mom left us something." "A box?" Emma asked, confused. "Money," Marcus said. He looked at Richard, unable to say the number. "It was too big for this room." "Your mother left you a trust," Richard said, stepping in. His voice was gentle, stripped of its usual boardroom edge. "She saved for a long time, Emma. She left you enough money that you will never have to worry about this apartment again. You are going to have a safe home, good schools, everything she wanted for you." Mrs. Rodriguez let out a sound that was half gasp, half sob. She covered her mouth with a worn, calloused hand. "Linda, that crazy, beautiful woman, she actually did it." "Did what?" Emma asked, looking between them, her brow furrowed. "Does this mean we can pay the super?" Marcus choked back a sob. "Yeah, Em, we can pay the super." Emma was quiet for a long moment. Her dark eyes searched Marcus's face. She was processing it with the logic of a child who had grown up too fast. Then she asked the question Richard Blackwell would hear in his nightmares for the rest of his life. "Marcus," she whispered, "does this mean we do not have to be hungry anymore?" Richard turned away. He stared at a crack in the plaster, blinking fast, fighting the sting in his eyes. He had thrown away a half-eaten steak at lunch today. He had complained that his Pellegrino was not cold enough. And right here, in the shadow of the richest city on earth, an 8-year-old girl was asking permission to eat. "No, baby," Marcus said, pulling her into his chest so she would not see him cry. "We never have to be hungry again, I promise." Mrs. Rodriguez was weeping openly now, rocking back and forth. "She worked herself into the grave," she murmured. Coming home at 3 a.m., bleeding from her hands, and she would still wake up to braid this baby's hair. We knew she was sick. We all knew, but she just kept smiling. "She was protecting you," Richard said, his voice thick. He turned back to face them. "Right to the very end." "She was," Mrs. Rodriguez agreed. She stood up, wiped her face with her apron, and her expression hardened. "But she could not protect you from everything." The tone in her voice made Richard stiffen. The warmth in the room vanished in an instant. "What do you mean?" Marcus asked, standing up. Mrs. Rodriguez walked to the kitchen counter. She picked up a heavy, sealed envelope that had been hidden under a stack of utility bills. She did not hand it to Marcus. She handed it to Richard. "The super broke the door," Mrs. Rodriguez whispered, glancing at the window as if the glass had ears. "But he was not the only one here today." Richard took the envelope. It was not regular mail. Thick, heavy bond paper. No return address. No stamp. It had been hand-delivered. "2 men came by before the super," she hissed. "They wore suits. Expensive ones, like yours." Richard felt the blood drain from his face. "What did they want?" They asked if Linda left a key, Mrs. Rodriguez said, her voice trembling. They said the money in the bank is fine, but they want what she stole. Richard looked down at the envelope in his hand. The seal was not wax. It was a thumbprint in red ink. When he turned it over, he saw a symbol embossed on the back, a symbol he recognized from the darkest corners of the international market. Linda Chen had not just saved money. She had taken insurance, and the people she took it from were coming to collect. Are you going to help us? Emma's voice was small, cutting through the heavy air of the apartment. She clutched a stuffed rabbit that had been loved down to bare stitching, one ear hanging by a single thread. She looked at Richard not as a billionaire, but as the only thing standing between her and the terrifying unknown. Richard looked at the broken door frame. He felt the weight of the red sealed envelope in his inside jacket pocket, a death threat disguised as a message. Yes, Richard said. And for the first time in 20 years, he was not calculating an ROI. I am going to help both of you, but we need to move now. He turned to Marcus. Grab what matters, leave the rest. We have 10 minutes. The next hour was not a sentimental packing montage. It was an extraction. Marcus and Emma moved with the efficiency of children who were used to instability. Clothes went into black garbage bags. School papers, a box of crayons, and the few framed photos of Linda Chen were wrapped in t-shirts and shoved into a small suitcase. Richard stood by the window, peering through the grime at the street below. He was watching for black sedans. He was watching for suits. Mr. Blackwell? Marcus asked, pulling down the last crayon drawing from the wall. We are ready. As they stepped into the hallway, Mrs. Rodriguez was waiting. She did not ask questions. She simply pressed a rosary into Marcus's hand and hugged Emma so tight her knuckles turned white. You are good kids, she whispered fiercely, her eyes flicking to the broken lock on the door. Your mama raised you to survive. Do not let the money make you soft, Mijo. You hear me? I will not, Marcus promised. The walk down the stairs felt like a funeral procession. Doors cracked open as they passed. A young mother with a baby on her hip, an elderly man in a security guard uniform. They all stepped out. They knew. In a building like this, secrets traveled faster than sound. They knew the Chens were leaving, and they knew why. There was no jealousy, no bitterness, just hands reaching out to touch Marcus's shoulder, to slip a chocolate bar into Emma's pocket. An old man tried to press a crumpled $20 bill into Marcus's hand. For emergencies. Richard watched, stunned. He lived in a penthouse where he did not know his next-door neighbor's name. Here, amid peeling paint and the smell of mildew, was a loyalty money could not buy. When they finally reached the Mercedes, Richard did not breathe easy until the doors were locked and the engine was purring. He checked the rearview mirror, no tail, just the crumbling brick of the tenement, fading into the Bronx twilight. Thank you, Marcus said from the back seat. His hand rested on Emma's knee, keeping her from shaking. For coming with me, for not making me do this alone. Richard gripped the leather steering wheel until his gloves creaked. The envelope in his pocket felt like it was burning a hole against his ribs. Marcus, Richard said, meeting the boy's eyes in the mirror. I need you to hear this. The car went quiet. What I did this morning, judging you, mocking you, it was unforgivable. Richard's voice was tight. I have spent my entire life convincing myself that net worth equals human worth. I thought I was superior because I had the suit and the office. He paused, guiding the car onto FDR Drive, the Manhattan skyline rising like a fortress ahead of them. But your mother, she worked herself to death to build a shield for you. She cleaned my office while I sat there ignoring her. She was worth 10 of me. Mom always said being kind is free, Emma said softly, her voice muffled by the rabbit. She was right, Richard said. And I am going to try to be the kind of person she would have respected. I promise you that. 3 months later, the penthouse on Park Avenue smelled like vanilla and fresh rain. The transformation was absolute. The stark, cold lines of the corporate apartment had been softened by the chaos of childhood. Emma's drawings were now professionally framed, hanging alongside original oil paintings. A stack of library books sat on the Italian marble coffee table. In the kitchen, Mrs. Patterson, a retired schoolteacher with a steel spine and a heart of gold, was teaching Emma how to knead dough. The sound of their laughter filled the high-ceilinged room. Marcus sat on the balcony, looking out at the city. He wore new clothes that actually fit, but on his feet, he still wore the old sneakers with the duct tape residue on the soles. He refused to throw them away. It was a perfect, peaceful Sunday morning. But the most dramatic transformation had not happened in the apartment. It had happened 40 blocks south, in the corner office of Blackwell and Associates. Richard sat at his desk. The lights were off, the blinds were drawn. On the desk in front of him lay the contents of the heavy envelope Mrs. Rodriguez had given him 3 months ago. He had spent every night since then going through it, chasing leads, using every connection he had in the global banking underworld. He picked up a photograph that had been inside the envelope, a grainy surveillance shot taken 10 years ago. It showed Linda Chen in a janitor's uniform, pushing a trash cart out of a conference room. But it was not what she was pushing that mattered. It was what she was holding. In the zoomed-in grain of the photo, Linda was clutching a small silver flash drive. Richard let the photo fall and picked up the second item from the envelope, a single sheet of paper with a list of coordinates and a date. The date was tomorrow. He reached for his phone, dialing a number that did not exist in any public directory. "It is Blackwell," he said when the line clicked open. "I found it. She did not just leave them money. She left them. The evidence." Richard swiveled his chair to the window, his eyes hard on the skyline. "And now I know," he said quietly, "why they killed her." The sun had not even broken the horizon when Richard Blackwell walked into the lobby of his own bank. It was 5 a.m. The building was a tomb of marble and glass, silent except for the steady whir of a commercial vacuum cleaner. Richard stood in the shadows, watching. He held the silver flash drive in his pocket, the one Linda Chen had died to protect. It contained terabytes of encrypted data, proving that for years, money had been washed through this very lobby right under his nose, and the only people who had noticed were the ones Richard never looked at. He watched a woman in a blue uniform emptying trash cans. She moved like a ghost, wiping down the mahogany desks of men who made more in an hour than she made in a year. Linda Chen had been one of these ghosts, and because she was invisible, she had seen everything. To catch a killer, Richard realized he did not need the FBI, he needed the ghosts. He walked over to the woman. She froze, gripping her spray bottle like a weapon when she saw the CEO standing there in the half-light. "Good morning," Richard said, his voice echoing in the empty hall. "I am Richard Blackwell." The woman stared at him, terrified. I have my ID, sir. I'm supposed to be here." "I know," Richard said gently. "I am not here to check your ID. I am here to ask your name." "Gloria," she whispered. "Gloria Ramirez." "Gloria," Richard repeated. "Did you know Linda?" The name hit her like a physical blow. Gloria's eyes filled with tears, and she nodded slowly. "She was my partner, sir, for 5 years on the 4th floor." "Tell me," Richard said, pulling up a chair, an act that seemed to shock her more than his presence. "Tell me everything she saw." They talked for an hour. Gloria told him about the late-night meetings Linda had walked in on, the shred documents she had pulled from the wrong trash cans, the men who showed up after hours when the official workday was done. But she also told him about the wages, the missed meals, the times Linda had to choose between antibiotics and rent. By the time the sun hit the glass towers of Wall Street, Richard Blackwell was not just angry, he was weaponized. At 9 a.m., the board of directors filed into the conference room. They expected a quarterly review. What they got was an execution. "Gentlemen," Richard said, standing at the head of the table. He did not have a PowerPoint. He had a flash drive sitting in the center of the table like a grenade. "We are making changes." He did not start with the money laundering. He started with the people. Effective immediately, the hourly wage for all maintenance and service staff is tripled, Richard announced. Full medical, full dental, and a scholarship fund for their children. The room exploded. "Have you lost your mind?" shrieked a heavy-set board member named Sterling, a man Richard knew was skimming off the Cayman accounts. "This will obliterate our margins. These people are disposable resources." "Disposable?" Richard smiled. It was the coldest thing Sterling had ever seen. "Mr. Sterling, the woman who cleansed your trash can, knows more about this bank's integrity than you do. And unlike you, She is not stealing from me. Silence slammed into the room. Two of you are resigning today, Richard said, his eyes moving across the faces of the men tied to Linda's files. You know who you are. If you sign the resignation papers, you leave with your pensions. If you fight me, I give this drive to the SEC and you leave in handcuffs. It was the bloodiest board meeting in the bank's 100-year history. By noon, security was escorting two senior partners out of the building. By 1 p.m., the press was running headlines. Blackwell goes rogue. Banking titan's socialist turn worries investors. Richard read the headlines and laughed. He finally understood what Linda knew. Real power was not about hoarding gold. It was about cleaning house. 3 months later, the autumn sun cut through the blinds of Richard's office, lighting a room that felt lighter, cleaner. Mr. Blackwell? The intercom buzzed. The Chens are here. Richard smiled, a real, unforced smile he had not had a year ago. Send them in. The door opened, and the transformation took his breath away. Marcus walked in first. The hunted look was gone from his eyes, replaced by a quiet, steady confidence. He wore a blazer that fit his shoulders and clean denim. He looked like a kid, yes, but he carried himself like a young king. And Emma, the little girl who had hidden behind a stuffed rabbit, was gone. In her place was a whirlwind in a bright yellow dress, holding a piece of paper like a trophy. Mr. Blackwell, she yelled, ignoring every rule of boardroom etiquette as she ran around the desk and hugged him. I got 100. 100, Richard laughed, hugging her back. Let me see. He studied the math test with more focus than he gave his P&L sheets. Flawless, he declared. He opened his desk drawer and pulled out a gold star, a supply he now kept just for these visits. This goes in, the permanent record. Emma beamed. She stuck the star to her chest, then hopped onto the leather sofa to read her book. Richard turned to Marcus. The boy took the seat opposite the desk, sitting with a poise that reminded Richard eerily of James Morrison. You look good, Marcus, Richard said. I feel good, Marcus admitted. School is easy compared to worrying about the super. And the apartment? Mrs. Patterson is teaching me how to cook, Marcus said, smiling. She says I chop vegetables like I'm angry at them. But the stew turns out okay. They shared a laugh, but Richard noticed the smile did not quite reach Marcus's eyes. There was something else there, a weight. Mr. Blackwell, Marcus said, leaning forward, I wanted to talk to you. Business. Richard straightened, giving the 12-year-old his full attention. I am listening. I have been thinking about the money, Marcus began. And the letter. Mom said money is just a tool. It is what you build with it. That matters. She was right, Richard said. I want to start a foundation, Marcus said. For kids like me and Emma, kids who have to tape their shoes, kids who are invisible. That is a noble goal, Marcus, Richard said, nodding. We can set up a charitable trust, scholarships, food programs. No, Marcus cut him off. His voice dropped, losing its childish edge. He reached into his backpack. Not just charity, Mr. Blackwell. Protection. Marcus pulled out a black notebook. Old, water-damaged. It still smelled like the Bronx apartment. I found this in Mom's old locker at the bus terminal, Marcus whispered. Mrs. Rodriguez gave me the key yesterday. Richard felt the temperature in the room fall. What is it? He asked. It is a list, Marcus said, sliding the notebook across the pristine desk. Mom did not just find the money laundering, Richard. She found the names of the people who were paying the board members. Marcus looked up. His eyes were dark, with a kind of justice no amount of money could calm. I do not want to just feed kids, Mr. Blackwell, Marcus said. I want to use the foundation to hunt the men on this list. I want to make sure they never hurt anyone's mother, ever again. Richard opened the notebook. The first name on the list was not a banker. It was a senator. He looked at the boy, then at the damning book in his hands. He realized right then that the story was not over. The rescue was finished. The war was just beginning. Okay, Richard said, closing the book. Let us get to work. We left Richard Blackwell staring at a black notebook, a ledger of corruption that tied the death of a cleaning lady to the highest halls of Congress. The war was coming, but before the first shot could be fired, Marcus Chen had a different move to make. He did not want revenge. He wanted a legacy. Richard slid the notebook into his top drawer and turned the key. He shifted his attention back to the 12-year-old sitting across from him. I want to help them, Marcus said, his voice steady. The kids like me, the ones whose parents work 3 shifts and still have to choose between heating and eating. Richard felt a tightness in his throat he had not felt in years. That is a beautiful idea, Marcus, he said quietly. What did you have in mind? A scholarship program? A food drive? Everything, Marcus said. He pulled a fresh legal pad from his backpack. He had been taking notes. Tutoring, legal aid for evictions, medical bills, but mostly, I want to make people see them the way you did not see me. Richard did not flinch at the blow. He deserved it. You are right, he said. I did not. I have done the math with Mrs. Patterson, Marcus continued, flipping a page. I want to call it the Linda Chen Foundation for Working Families, and I want to put up the seed money today. Seed money is smart, Richard nodded, slipping into banker mode without losing the respect in his eyes. How much are we talking? $10 million, Marcus said. Richard blinked. He leaned back in his chair, the leather creaking in the silence. Marcus, that is 20% of your entire trust, he said slowly. That is a massive commitment for a minor. I know, Marcus replied. His jaw set in a way that made Richard think of Linda. But Mom did not save that money so I could buy Ferraris when I turned 25. She saved it so I could matter. She saved it so I could make a difference. Running a foundation is a business, Marcus, Richard cautioned, his tone gentle but firm. It needs a board, oversight, compliance. It is not just writing a check. I know, Marcus said. That is why I need you. I need you to show me how to make it work. I need the shark, Mr. Blackwell. Richard looked at the boy. 3 months ago, he would have laughed. He would have called it a tax write-off, a naive fantasy. But the man in this chair today was different. He had been broken open, and for the first time, he liked what was inside. I would be honored, Richard said softly, on one condition. Marcus narrowed his eyes. What condition? That you let me match it, Richard said. 10 million from your trust, 10 million from my personal accounts. Marcus's eyes went wide. You would do that? Your mother taught me a lesson that an MBA never could, Richard said. He stood and walked to the floor-to-ceiling window. I used to measure my life in quarterly gains and market share. I was rich, and I was miserable. I was terrifying to my employees and a stranger to my family. He turned back to the kids. Because of you, I am sleeping through the night. I actually like coming to work. He paused, his voice softening. And I called my daughter. Marcus smiled. You have a daughter? Sarah, Richard nodded. She is 25. She has not spoken to me in 4 years. She hated who I was. But she heard about the wage hikes. She heard about the cleaning staff. She called me last week. Did you see her? Emma asked, looking up from her book. We had coffee, Richard said, his eyes glistening. 3 hours. No phones, no business. Just talking. I told her about you two. I told her about Linda. And at the end, she told me she was proud of me. Richard let out a short, wet laugh. Do you know how long it has been since someone was proud of me? Not impressed by the yacht, proud of the man. Emma slid off the couch. She walked over to the billionaire, reached up and patted his hand. I am proud of you, Mr. Blackwell, she said. The simple, unpolished truth of it nearly broke him. Richard had to clear his throat, fighting to keep his composure. Thank you, Emma. That means everything. A sharp knock at the door shattered the moment. James Morrison poked his head in, looking flustered. Richard, sorry to interrupt. The crew from Channel 7 is setting up in the atrium. We are live in 20 minutes. Interview? Marcus asked, glancing between them. I meant to tell you, Richard said, checking his watch. The press has been hounding us about the policy changes. They want to know why a Wall Street shark suddenly grew a heart. I agreed to a prime-time exclusive. He looked at Marcus. They want to know the story, Marcus. They know a mystery client was the catalyst. I was going to keep you anonymous. You do not have to do this. What would the interview do? Marcus asked. It would set the narrative, Richard explained. It would force other CEOs to look in the mirror. It could change how this whole city treats its invisible workers. Marcus thought about it. He thought about the notebook in the desk drawer. He thought about the men who had threatened his mother. I will do it, Marcus decided. But I do not want to talk about the bank. I want to talk about my mom. Then that is what we will do, Richard said. They walked out of the office together, the billionaire and the orphans. They rode the elevator down to the atrium. where the lights were bright and the cameras were waiting. But as they stepped onto the makeshift stage, Richard scanned the room. He was not looking for the camera lens. He was looking at the exits. He knew that going live on national television was not just a PR move. It was a flare. He was putting Marcus on every screen in America. He was daring the men in that black notebook to make a move. The reporter clipped a microphone to Richard's lapel. And we are live in 3, 2. Richard looked into the camera lens, his face hardening into steel. He was not just about to announce a foundation. He was about to declare war. We left Richard Blackwell staring into the lens of a television camera, waiting for the red tally light to blink on. He was not just sitting for an interview. He was lighting a beacon. He knew the men in Linda Chen's black notebook were watching. He knew the senator was watching, and he wanted them to know he was coming. We are live in 3, 2. The studio lights flared. Sarah Chen leaned forward. She was the investigative reporter who had taken down 2 city councilmen the year before. No relation to Marcus, but the same fierce focus in her eyes. Mr. Blackwell, Sarah began, her voice crisp. 3 months ago, Wall Street called you the butcher of Broadway. Your management style was described as predatory. Today, you are tripling wages for janitors. What changed? Richard did not look at the reporter. He looked straight into the camera lens, speaking to the enemies he knew were monitoring the feed. I met a 12-year-old boy, Richard said, his voice steady. A boy who showed me that my entire balance sheet was a lie. He gestured to Marcus, seated beside him under the hot lights. The boy did not flinch. I humiliated this young man in my lobby because he did not look like he belonged, Richard continued. I judged him by his shoes, and while I was doing that, his mother, a woman who cleaned my offices for 5 years, was proving she was a better financial planner than anyone on my board. Sarah turned to Marcus. Marcus, tell us about her. This was the moment. The script Richard and Marcus had rehearsed did not include the notebook or the murder. Not yet. That was the trap. For now, they needed the public to fall in love with the victim. Her name was Linda, Marcus said. He spoke clearly, his voice carrying a weight beyond his years. She worked 3 jobs. She wore the same coat for 6 winters. She skipped dinner so my sister and I could eat. Marcus looked at the camera. She did not save $50 million because she wanted to be rich, he said. She saved it because she was scared. She wanted to make sure that no matter what happened to her, we would be safe. The studio was dead silent. Even the camera operators had stopped chewing their gum. And that is why, Marcus announced, dropping the bomb, I am pledging $10 million from my trust to launch the Linda Chen Foundation. We are not just giving out scholarships. We are going to provide legal defense for working families. We are going to fight for the people no one sees. Sarah turned back to Richard, one eyebrow raised. Critics say you have gone soft, Richard, she said. They say you are sacrificing shareholder value for a PR stunt. Richard smiled. It was the smile of a shark that had just tasted blood in the water. My critics are idiots, Richard said flatly. Since we raised wages and treated our staff like human beings, productivity is up 40%. Profits are at an all-time high. Turns out, when you do not treat people like garbage, they actually want you to succeed. Who knew? He leaned in, his face hardening. I do not care what the street thinks anymore. For 45 years, I chased approval from men I did not respect. Now, I only care about being able to look in the mirror. When the cameras cut, the tension in the room broke. The crew packed up in silence, clearly moved. Marcus and Emma stood by the elevator bank, ready to head home with Mrs. Patterson. Thank you, Marcus said, shaking Richard's hand, for letting me tell her story. You saved me, Marcus, Richard replied, holding the boy's hand a moment longer than necessary. You gave me a reason to fight. Emma tugged on Richard's sleeve. When he looked down, she wrapped her arms around his waist. You are a good guy, Mr. Blackwell. I am trying, kid, Richard whispered. Every damn day. Richard watched them leave, the elevator doors sliding shut on the only family he felt he had left. He walked back to his office alone. The sun was setting over Manhattan, casting long, bloody shadows across his desk. He picked up the phone and dialed James. It is done, Richard said. The foundation is public. The bait is in the water. I saw, James replied, his voice tense. The stock is actually up 2 points. But Richard, are you sure about the next step? I want to expand the program, Richard said, brushing past the warning. On-site childcare, educational grants for employees' kids. I want to build a fortress of goodwill around this place so high that if anyone tries to attack us, the public outcry will bury them. We can start planning tomorrow, James agreed. Good. Richard hung up. He sat in the silence of his office, the office Linda Chen used to clean. He turned to his computer. He had personal bridges to mend. He opened a new email draft. To Sarah Blackwell. Subject, I am sorry. He typed for 20 minutes, pouring out decades of regret. No excuses, just an apology to the daughter he had neglected. He hit send. He felt a strange lightness in his chest. Peace. Then, his private line rang. It was not the office phone. It was the burner phone he kept locked in the bottom drawer, the one only 3 people had the number for. Richard stared at it. The peace evaporated. He opened the drawer and picked up the device. Blackwell. The voice on the other end was distorted, digital and cold. Nice interview, Richard. Very touching. Richard's grip tightened on the phone. Who is this? You think a foundation protects you? The voice laughed, a dry, rasping sound. You think putting the boy on TV makes him safe? You just reminded us where he is. If you come near those kids, Richard growled, rising to his feet, I will release the files. I have the notebook. We know, the voice said. That is why we are not coming for the kids, Richard. There was a pause, a heavy, terrifying silence. We are going for the daughter you just emailed. Sarah, she lives in Boston, right? Nice apartment on Newberry Street? The line went dead. Richard dropped the phone. The color drained from his face as he stared at the computer screen, at the word sent on the email to his daughter. He had not just apologized. He had just led them right to her. The line was dead. The office was silent. The digital hum of the server room sounded like a countdown. Richard did not scream. He did not throw the phone. The butcher of Broadway did not panic. He executed. He grabbed the secure line to James. Code Black, Richard said. They targeted Sarah. Get the extraction team to Newberry Street. You have 4 minutes. Then Richard unlocked his top drawer. He pulled out the black notebook, Linda Chen's legacy. He did not look at the list of senators or cartel fronts written inside. He looked at the flash drive. You want to threaten my family? Richard whispered to the empty room. Then I will burn your whole world down. He plugged the drive in. He did not send the files to the FBI. Too slow. He sent them to Sarah Chen at Channel 7, to the New York Times, and to a massive encrypted, verified dump on the dark web. He hit enter. The upload bar filled. The war had begun. 2 weeks later, the fallout was nuclear. The New York Times called it the Chen Papers. 3 senators had resigned in disgrace. A REE co-indictment had ripped through the upper levels of New York finance like a plague. The men in suits were not knocking on doors anymore. They were shredding documents and calling their lawyers. Richard Blackwell stood on the balcony of the penthouse, looking out at a city that felt different than it had a month ago. He was tired. He had aged 10 years in 10 days. His stock price had cratered, then rebounded, then stabilized. He had spent hours in depositions. But Sarah was safe. She was inside in the kitchen, laughing with Emma and Marcus. Richard watched them through the glass sliding doors. He saw his daughter, the one who had not spoken to him in years, showing Marcus how to make an espresso. He saw Mrs. Patterson plating cookies. He saw a family. He had a lot of work to do. He had decades of negligence to repair with his daughter and with the invisible workforce he had exploited to build his empire. But for the first time in his life, Richard Blackwell was doing work that actually mattered. He thought back to that morning, the dirty kid, the duct-taped shoes, the whisper across the marble floor asking to check a balance. The screen had shown a number, $47.3 million. And that number had frozen Richard's smile. It had terrified him, but it was what happened after. The terror, the shame, the hunt, and the redemption. That finally thawed his heart. He took a slow sip of his coffee, steam rising into the crisp autumn air. Linda Chen had taught him the only lesson Wall Street could not monetize. True wealth is not measured in the zeros on your bank account. It is measured in the number of people who breathe easier because you exist. The transformation had cost him his reputation among the elite. It had cost him his safety. It had nearly cost him his daughter. and it was worth more than any amount of money could ever be. Richard turned to go back inside, to join the laughter, to finally be the father and the man he was supposed to be. His hand closed around the door handle. His phone buzzed. It was not a text. It was a notification from the bank's internal security system. A proximity alert. Richard frowned. He opened the app and checked the camera feed. Down in the lobby of the bank, the very spot where he had humiliated Marcus, a figure was standing at the reception desk. It was a young girl, maybe 10 years old. Her coat was torn. Her shoes were muddy. She was clutching a thick, sealed envelope with both hands. Richard zoomed in on the feed. The girl looked up, staring directly into the security camera with eyes that were too old, too hard, and far too familiar. She lifted the envelope and held it up to the lens. It bore the same red wax seal as the one Linda Chen had left behind. Richard's blood ran cold. He understood in an instant that Linda had not been the only one who kept a list, and she had not been the only one who had sent a messenger. He looked through the glass at his family in the kitchen, happy, safe, laughing. Then he looked back down at the girl on the screen, the child who had just walked into the lion's den. Richard Blackwell straightened his tie. He did not go inside to join his family. He turned away from the door and headed for the elevator. The first verdict had been silent. The next one was going to be loud.